Okay, great. We are live on Facebook, and I think we have some folks hopefully joining us in the Zoom room as well. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm Desti from the Maine Women's Lobby, and I'm very happy here today to have Ryan Tipping to chat about Mainers for Tax Fairness. Before we jump into anything, just a little bit of housekeeping. We're thrilled to have people on the live stream. If you have questions or comments to talk to either of us, you want to hear more about the bills, you want to hear more about the work that Mainers for Tax Fairness is doing, you can go ahead and drop them into the comments section of Facebook, and we will be sure to get to them. So please, join in on the conversation. We're happy to have you. So, hi, Ryan. Tell me a little bit about Mainers for Tax Fairness.
Hey, Dusty. Thank you for having me. And also thanks for all the great work your organization does to make our state a better place. So Mainers for Tax Fairness is a relatively new coalition. It's currently sitting at 23 members of different groups from across the state that do a lot of different things. Some are healthcare oriented, some are advocacy oriented, some are unions focused on improving the state for their members and for other workers. And some are think tanks. I work for Maine Center for Economic Policy, which is a group that does a lot of the policy work behind the coalition. Part of my job is to work with organizations that are getting involved in tax policy. So the coalition was founded to bring more fairness, more efficiency, more adequacy, equity, and democracy to Maine's tax code. Those 5 principles are what we started talking to organizations about before I came on board last year. And so far, a lot of different groups that haven't been involved previously in the fight for fairer taxes have gotten together to try and speak with one voice and also bring a more diverse viewpoints from across the spectrum to the conversation about taxes. So yeah, it's exciting. I'm sure in your work and the work of a lot of the organizations that are part of the coalition, people have fought for years for new projects or better funding for current projects that in the state that would have make definitive progress to make people's lives better. We've seen unanimous votes on bills that everyone agrees with to add more funding to good programs, only to see it die on the appropriations table for lack of funding. I'm sure I could ask you to rattle off a list of bills like that.
That's actually how we were founded. I don't know if you know our origin story.
Really?
True story. The lobby was founded in 1978 with their first big bill that was to do the first state funding for battered women's shelters. And they, these citizens did all of the work that they needed to do, they thought, to make this happen, and were quite surprised to wake up the morning after the session adjourned to discover that it hadn't made it through appropriations because there wasn't anybody in the room.
Yeah. And, part of that disparity comes from a lot of the companies and wealthy individuals that have helped build our tax code to be the way it is, have people in the room. They can afford to have the attorneys, the accountants, and the lobbyists to build a system that works for them. So we're working to bring more fairness to the tax code and to build a bigger set of voices to be better involved in that process.
Nice. So I think there are a surprising number of tax-related bills this session. Maybe I just haven't been so tuned into it before as I am now, probably in thanks to Mainers for Tax Fairness. But I'm surprised to see how many bills are coming up this year that are really specifically about tax fairness. Do you want to give us a little overview of some of the highlights?
Sure. And if you go to mainersfortaxfairness.org, you can check out all the bills that our coalition members are getting involved with, and some resources for background on those bills too, not just the titles. But everything from looking at the corporate income tax rate to looking at how our personal income tax rates and brackets are structured, to looking at loopholes that have been used by corporations and wealthy people to avoid paying taxes in the past, whether that's offshore tax havens, where companies can create shell corporations and hide profits off overseas to avoid paying taxes here in Maine, or looking at just increasing loopholes on things like the estate tax, where the exclusion amount has increased. So the ultra wealthy pay less when they pass on their estates and build intergenerational wealth. So those are some of the bills we're looking at. There's a couple around the estate tax exclusion amount. There's a whole bunch on the income tax. There was a lot of energy around that from senators and House members to address the inherent unfairness in the way that brackets are currently set up. And there's a bill on tax havens as well, trying to build our system in a way that prevents companies from being able to hide their profits overseas. Those are just a few of the priorities that our coalition members are watching and engaging on.
That's great. So we're sort of like, it feels like we're winding down, although we have about a month left still in the session. But where are some of those bills in the process? What can people expect in terms of getting things out of committee? And then I am also curious about what people can expect in terms of how you work a tax bill into the budget, if that's something you can kind of respond to. So where are we in the cycle?
Yeah, I think in a normal budget year, and I think definitely coming into this session, a budget is a moral document. It shows us where we're putting our priorities, what communities we care about, making sure we're lifting people up when they need it and making sure we're paying for resources in an equitable way. So I think having individual bills put forward that change the tax code in different ways usually would give the Appropriations Committee different options to look at, and public hearings for other people to comment on different strategies of ways to close a budget. This year has been a little bit different. I think a lot of legislators put in income tax bills because of the massive shortfall that we had heard was projected to happen this year. But at the same time, we have seen that peter out. We've seen our some parts of our economy do better than expected. And we've seen federal action when maybe back in December or November, when legislators were putting in these bills, federal action didn't really seem like it was going to happen to bring dollars down to the state of Maine. So, we have these great proposals. I think it's also important to recognize that before talk of the pandemic and the recession, we still had a whole set of unmet needs. There were people struggling before the pandemic that are struggling more now. And there were people who were doing very well before the pandemic who are doing even better now. So I got a little off track on an answer to your question, but as the budget committee, takes a look at both the levers on how to raise revenue and where it should go, equity should be part of that conversation. And a lot of these bills show how revenue can be raised in a way that also addresses income inequality and the inherent unfairness in the way our tax code is written.
I had a thought that just completely disappeared.
Well, I didn't answer the first part of your question, where the bills are, if you want me to.
Sure. Great.
So a few of the bills are still in a holding pattern. Some of the stuff is pretty complicated, and we're also seeing federal action possible. So some of the bills might be held over, but some of the bills we've actually seen great action on. Earlier this week, LD 498 was voted out of the tax committee with a majority ought to pass divided report. And that bill would bring back the income tax surcharge from the Stand Up for Students referendum a few years back and put it towards increasing the earned income tax credit, which is one of the best tax tools we have at putting money in the hands of people who need it the most.
We actually
working
had
moms.
Maine.
So it's an exciting vote out of the tax committee, and there's still votes to come within the committee on the estate tax bills and other legislation. So it may seem like things are winding down, but now is actually an incredibly important time for people to speak up and use their voice.
My disappeared thought came back to me, thinking about how federal, there are sort of big federal receipts coming into the state, which I think is great and important. I worry that people will use that as an opportunity to avoid making the structural changes in Maine that we know we need to make in order to have long-term sustainability and care in our community. Because that's great for 1 year, 2 years, maybe 3 years, but then what? Like, we need to take the learning of the last year of the pandemic and make the structural changes in our state now that we want to have, come to fruition in 5 years, 10 years.
Yeah, it's always hard when legislators are dealing with like immediate reactionary needs, and also, they should be looking 5-10 years down the road and setting up our state for success that way. And while, yeah, you're right, some of this federal funding might fill holes temporarily, it's important that, our recovery is long-term and complete and addresses the pre-pandemic status quo that was already leaving a lot of people behind. Right. Also, a lot of these changes take a year or two to come into effect, just the way the tax code works. We don't want to change how taxes are calculated this year because people have already filed their taxes. So some of these changes, take a year or two for increased revenue to actually start coming in. But I mean, even Governor Mills admitted that, with the influx of federal funds and a rosier picture coming from the economic outlook, the revenue forecast and the economic forecast committees, there are still more needs than there is money to address those needs.
I think that when you raise the question of equity, and for me, that's where the connection between taxes and gender comes in. We're a gender equity organization, so I always want to make sure we bring to the table that the intersection of whatever we're talking about, and the reality is, I think so often gender equity gets sort of compartmentalized into, childcare, or like things only the ladies care about, the tampon tax, and like that's just not true. Because women are, half the population, but also gender inequity works in ways that aren't always expected. And for me, that's one of the things that feels really important to lift up when we think about taxes. There's not a clean, bright line, but there are all of these different ways that taxes and budget intersect with the health of women and girls and people who experience gender discrimination. For example, women are by far more likely to be in poverty in Maine and everywhere. So we're really talking about women and kids who are bearing the brunt of our inability to invest in a social safety net or social infrastructure. So when we don't raise enough money to invest in our population, like, women are left holding the bag. I also, on the side of actual revenue, when, I'm not an economist, so I can't speak to the best ways to structure revenue, but I do know that when we give disproportionate tax breaks to, say, corporations or to wealthy people, because women are the people in poverty and women are not generally in leadership at corporations, those tax breaks disproportionately are benefiting men. And then at the bottom end of it, when we can't invest in the services, like women get sort of the double hit. So to me, thinking about taxes is just really important work for organizations that are thinking about the health of women and girls, and especially, Black and Brown and Indigenous women and girls who are experiencing even more inequity.
Yeah, and I think we all share the goal of shared prosperity in our state. And when we address systemic inequity, whether it's based on gender lines or racial lines or whatever, it when we address it head on and actually use the levers available to the state, things better, state benefits. These don't happen in a vacuum. It's not like we're just helping some people or other people. When our state does better, we all do better. When people have access to the chance to start their own business, even though they don't have an army of attorneys and lawyers, when people have the chance to interview for jobs because they know they have childcare taken care of, when, whatever barriers there are, when we eliminate those, our state does better as a whole. And
Right.
none of those conversations happen in a vacuum when it comes to funding them. We have to have a conversation about, do we have the revenue we need to take on the challenges of this generation and the next generation, and make sure that we're meeting those challenges head on and with the right tools.
Right. And I think we do know that we have the resources in Maine. We just need to sort of tap into them. So what do you think in terms of the future of some of these bills, or the future of maybe this way of thinking? What do you think are some surprises or challenges or things that people should know about this collection of bills or this work this session or next? Because I know it's all sort of linked.
Yeah, so I think this is a long-term project. I think for a long time in politics, taxes have been wielded like a cudgel to attack, certain groups or certain parties. But what we're seeing is more people are waking up to the fact that the tax code is rigged, and the people who have power are the ones who rigged it, and they're the ones who benefit from it. We're seeing massive popularity in addressing the code. And when we ask people face to face, either anecdotally or in statistically relevant samples, people are saying they want to see changes. But that doesn't always pierce the Augusta bubble. It doesn't always pierce the the Washington bubble, and those ideas don't always make it into action. So part of what we're trying to do is lift up those voices and try and change the narrative around taxes, around scarcity, around how we talk about this stuff, and hopefully bringing more voices into the conversation is part of that. But part of it is just confronting the old narratives around taxes head on, and talk about how it's incredibly popular to change the code to bring in more revenue from wealthy individuals and multinational corporations. And it's also better for the state when we do it.
I have a question here in the chat. Where's our leadership, do we think, on this? Are they, maybe still more lukewarm about some of this way of thinking?
So that's a good question, and that's kind of like a preconception that sometimes the folks working on revenue in Augusta are rabble rousers, and they're kind of on the fringe. But this year we've actually seen a shift. Speaker Fecto put in a bill to raise taxes on the wealthiest Mainers the people who were doing well, even all through the pandemic, to pay for hazard pay payments for people, frontline workers who were forced to put their lives and their families' lives on the line to keep showing up to work when a lot of white collar jobs went, remote. So it was great to see him propose that.
Here we all are, still sitting in our houses, right?
Yeah. So it was great to see him propose that, not only to benefit people who were struggling, some of which were making minimum wage to interact with people through the worst months of the pandemic, but also to look at the people who were doing well, in some cases doing much better, not in spite of, but because of the pandemic, looking to them to actually pay for that program. So that was a great sign. We've seen members of the Appropriations Committee, members of leadership support other reforms in the past. One of the bills on the estate tax, reducing the exclusion amount, which just means reducing the amount of your estate that is shielded from the estate tax. And that one of the bills was put forward by Representative Rachel Talbot Ross, Assistant Majority Leader in the House. So it's great to see members of leadership not just supporting, but actively participating, authoring bills and sponsoring them.
That's great news. Before we wrap up, is there anything that you hope that people will know or do, either as a result of this conversation or in the next couple of weeks as the session winds down?
That's a great question. So there are going to be some actions that our coalition partners are taking around income taxes, around the estate tax, around tax havens, and as the Appropriations Committee and the full legislature wrap up their conversations around what gets funded, that's all part of the conversation as well. So if you're engaged and paying attention to Maine Women's Lobby or one of the other groups, I encourage you to look for the chance to collect postcards or come to events and have your voice heard. People can also just go to Mainers for Fair Taxes.org, Mainers for Tax Fairness, .org, and you can sign up there as well. But part of what we're doing is also building awareness around these issues, making sure people can engage on them at a higher level and not be tricked by some of the lies that are frequently circulated around these bills from the other side, and build for forward progress into the future.
All right, well, great. And I think you're on Facebook. We will drop your Facebook page and your web page into the links on the Facebook live stream for this. And we will also be sharing the things that come out of the coalition on our page. I think there are some fun cartoons and you've done some really cool stuff to help people think about this in a new way. So we're happy to be on the coalition and grateful to get to talk about these structural things with you.
Well, yeah, and we appreciate having both your voice and your strategic thinking and making sure that your members and your followers also have the opportunity to engage on these issues.
Great. Well, thanks
you so much,
Ryan. I'm glad that you could be here today. And thanks to the folks watching. We will hopefully see you next week. So, all right, have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.